I do not, and I've said repeatedly, I don't want to interfere with anyone or force anything on them. You have to make those distinctions voluntarily and yourself.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. I am very excited to have Dr. Norman Horn on today's episode to discuss a very influential and controversial figure in libertarianism, and that is none other than Ayn Rand. But first, the guest. Dr. Norman Horn is the founder of the Libertarian Christian Institute, also known as LCI. He holds a PhD in chemical engineering and a Master of Arts in theological studies. He is also the author of multiple peer-reviewed publications in science, economics, and political theory. So, why are a couple of Christians talking about Ayn Rand? Well, let's get into the conversation. Dr. Norman Horn, how are you doing today?
Oh, dude, I am just wonderful. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. It's a great honor to be here.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming on. I've been a big fan of the Libertarian Christian Institute for a long time. I appreciate everything that y'all do over there.
Thanks,
all of
man.
the podcasts, the writings, and everything. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about was associated with a book that LCI put out or helped put out, and it's called Called to Freedom.
Yep.
And you wrote the foreword for this book. And in the foreword, you had a couple of sentences that really stuck out to me. They really resonated. And I wanted to have you on today to discuss that statement and Ayn Rand,
Right
whom
on.
you're referring to in the comments. So I guess before we get started, let me read off the statement. You say, "The specter of Ayn Rand loomed over the libertarian movement." And like I said, that statement really resonated with me. Could you tell the audience, I guess, a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure.
Flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah, okay. You know, there's a well-known book in the libertarian movement called "It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand," and that's it's appropriate because a lot of libertarians kind of come to an understanding about liberty having started reading Ayn Rand. Now that wasn't me in particular, but I know plenty of people who were like that. I met them as, they were students. I've met them in, the LP. I've met them, just wandering about in the libertarian movement in various respects. But, regardless of wherever you end up going, you're probably going to meet somebody who started off this way with Ayn Rand. And so, that's a good thing on some level. I mean, we want people to come to a better understanding of liberty, but there's some negatives to it as well, and that's kind of the crux of the statement is that there's a this sort of, well, for lack of a better word, I mean that's why I wrote it this way. There's kind of the specter of Ayn Rand, kind of that is always around us in a sense. She's had a great influence upon liberty and the libertarian movement as a whole, and so it's appropriate to kind of call that out, and for good and for ill, in both respects. So that's sort of the genesis of it, is recognizing how much influence that she's had, and saying that that's a good thing, but it's also got its negatives as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And with the topic of the book Call to Freedom, and with our mutual focus on our podcast, it's a big deal to Christians a lot. It's something that, as I've worked through libertarian thought and discussed that with people that were libertarians and not libertarians, it is something Ayn Rand just inevitably gets brought up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And your next sentence here in that foreword, I think really sums up the Christian aspect to it. And you said her strident atheism was frequently associated with libertarians, despite the fact Rand personally opposed libertarianism.
Yeah.
So I do want to break that down a little bit. And I guess just say on the onset that I'm not an anti-Ayn Rand person. And I know that you're not either. And so I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression as we start into this conversation. And also that there is this looming over, as you refer to, within the Christian side of this conversation, but also even in the non-libertarian, non-Christian side of this, where she has, I guess, affected libertarianism in that way, someone who would be more progressive or a Democrat or something like that. And so I want to get into all that. And before we do get started into that, though, maybe we should just back up a little bit for any listeners who aren't totally aware and give a little bit of a history of Ayn Rand. Can you tell us who was she? Who was Ayn Rand?
Well, I guess the best way to kind of begin with her is, well, literally from her beginnings. Ayn Rand was born in Russia back in the early part of the 20th century, and experienced even the communist revolution of that time, and that affected her greatly. She eventually found her way into the United States and appreciated the political liberty that one had, limited as it was, admittedly, but recognized that was a great value, in contrast to the communist way of life and how that dominated ultimately, what Russia/Soviet Union. And her experience, though, kind of led her into philosophical musings, and ultimately found herself really, using her ability to tell stories as a means by which to communicate philosophical ideas. And so the two major works that everybody remembers are her massive novels, The Fountainhead, and then the even larger one, Atlas Shrugged, which are often books that people encounter in high school and college and even as young adults, that really explains the breadth of her philosophy that she kind of developed through those and around those, called objectivism. And objectivism is a philosophy that where you'll hear some kind of terms that float around there, things like the virtue of selfishness, which is really just a kind of pointed way of talking about self-interest and why that's ultimately important. And that that's the types of things that you kind of hear that surround her philosophy.
Yeah, and I've heard people mention that, and I guess in hindsight say that if she would have just picked a better word than selfishness, it may have been a little bit better, I guess, easier to swallow some of this philosophy if she would have chosen a different word. And I could see that going for both sides, for the Christian side and the non-Christian side. That's both critical of Ayn Rand.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that, I think she probably chose that on some level because of it would rub up against people in kind of an awkward way, and it would force them to sort of think. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do, it definitely irks me a little bit, just to, it grates on you when you hear that, especially as Christians, where we're very much taught, we don't want to practice selfishness. But if you kind of recast it and understand it as, well, it's about understanding what is self-interest all about. It becomes a little more understandable and then we even begin to recognize that perhaps the way that the Christian can kind of even think about this is that we ultimately want to, even when we're practicing self-sacrifice, we recognize that our self-sacrifice is ultimately being done. We're exchanging something that we do not value or value less than something that for something that we value more. So we're trading up even in that case. So what we believe is that even if it maybe hurts my physical body, or I'm doing something that it diminishes me on some level, that I'm doing it because I value something else more. And so, that in that respect, there's actually a convergence even of that, of those kinds of thoughts, is that, I'm acting in my own self-interest, even when I'm making a sacrifice on some level. I'm exchanging something I value less for something I value more. And that something that is more may be ultimately, hopefully, is for the glory of God. And that, so when you can kind of see even those little small convergence points. And there are people who've recognized this. We've even got some articles up on libertarianchristians.com at the Libertarian Christian Institute website that sort of explain this. Even back as far as before we actually created LCI, there was libertarianchristians.com was still, it's the home. It was a website before it was a nonprofit, right? And so we've got stuff like that that's available for you to take a look at on our website. I'm sure we can probably provide that for you for your show notes and whatnot.
Oh, absolutely. And I will have a ton of show notes, I'm sure, whenever, as I'm kind of taking notes here as we're bringing things up.
Yeah.
And so with the selfishness and objectivism, she always casts those to the opposite of something else called altruism.
Right.
And I think that this is really where her philosophy came into conflict with Christianity.
Yeah.
And not just in our own thinking, but even in her teachings. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of what that means from Rand, and I guess just the way that we generally understand that?
Well, I think to Rand, altruism is kind of the opposite of acting in self-interest. And that is ultimately like the activity of trying to exchange things of greater value for things of lesser value it's a poor activity. And so to an extent, Rand interpreted types of things that, for instance, that happen in the Christian faith as being, altruistic in nature. But when you kind of peel back some of the layers there and even, what we were just discussing, that what we realize is that, even in what might be look to the outside as being somewhat altruistic, the actual thing taking place is and when, for instance, when Christian charity occurs, is that we are exchanging things that we don't value, or things that we value less, for things that we value more. And so to that end, it's essentially acting in a self-interested manner, even if it's clearly it appears from the outside that it's benefiting somebody else more than perhaps myself. I mean, a very simple example would be, is it altruistic to buy a meal for the homeless guy that's at the corner of the street or something? Well, it's on some level one might say, oh, well, that's acting altruistically. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that what I'm doing there is if I do that, I'm going to, I go to McDonald's and I buy a meal or whatever for the guy there at the corner of the street. I'm saying what I value right now is that this guy has a meal more than the $5 in my wallet. I am exchanging something I value more for something I value, and what I have currently I value less than what I'm exchanging it for, which is the ability to provide something for somebody else. Like that's a good thing. And even Rand admitted that there are ways in which charity can act in this manner. But I think the idea from even Rand's point of view, I think, is to explain that, like, don't recognize what you're doing when you're acting, in these sorts of manners. Don't just be like trying to, be self-flagellating all the time by saying like, well, I need to hurt myself in order to benefit somebody else. Like, realize that what you're doing is that you're exchanging value for value when you're going through these types of activities. And I think that's where, there's some convergence in the Christian way of thinking and even the way that Rand thinks.
Yeah, I've heard her defend her position of selfishness, but also helping someone else or someone else benefiting from her own selfishness.
Hmm.
And it makes sense in the way that she is defining everything. And this is where I think it is really good that, like you said earlier, the term is a little, offensive, selfishness, but it does kind of force us to get into the philosophy of it
Yeah.
and start discussing that, which is, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and you could argue that it's ultimately a good thing.
Well, and I think there's another thing that kind of stands behind that a little bit is that she's all about the use of reason. And this is something that we also can appreciate as Christians, looking at Rand, is that she is endeavoring to establish a philosophy and a way of life that is congruent with the use of reason. And we believe this as well as Christians. I mean, we even have there's a verse in the Bible that says, "Come, let us reason together," and that's a great thing. The merits of reason are to be lauded and appreciated. Now, hopefully, we will get to a proper use of reason. Hopefully, we will establish right premises so we get to the right conclusions as a result. But those means by which we get there, we appreciate and recognize as being valuable. And so, as that pertains to altruism, at least I think this is the way that Rand kind of views it: is that altruism is a irrational way of acting. Because it's not really thinking through what you're doing. In the way that she's defining and constructing it. It's realizing that altruism, and again, this is in her construction of the way of the thought, that altruism is exchanging things of higher value for lesser value. In other words, diminishing oneself as a result. That is an irrational way of acting, and we shouldn't do that. We should think reasonably. We should think rationally around our activities, and we may find that at least the reason for acting, or that the action itself, may end up being the same thing, but the reason for acting will be better understood. So, I think that can be valuable as well, and a reason to appreciate Ayn Rand and her work.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that there's a lot of value in having this discussion, or even if we don't come to a full agreement with each other, between a Christian and an objectivist. What would you say has hurt libertarianism from Ayn Rand's teachings, or her just her fiction writing, or whatever she's done and said out there? Just being this specter that's looming over this movement. What is it that exactly that has hurt libertarianism for both the Christian or the non-Christian perspective?
So to her credit, of course, Ayn Rand emphasizes individual liberty and capitalism, for instance, as being very important for society in general and for individuals. Her emphasis on individualism is good to the proper extent, right? But where things kind of go off the rails on some level is the equating of libertarianism with objectivism, the whole of her philosophy. Now, while we can, piece out or we can tease out pieces of her philosophy that we appreciate and think are good, we also can recognize that she did go in poor directions otherwise, and in many respects. She has a very strong atheist bent to her, and that's obviously something we can't accept that as Christians, and that we don't see that as being appropriate. And I mean, that's kind of de facto not part of our faith. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
So to that extent, if what you're doing, in libertarianism is you're equating, well, the whole of objectivism is libertarianism, then, that's a problem. And furthermore, we end up with an additional, issue of libertarianism is not an all-encompassing philosophy. And in fact, that's what Ayn Rand didn't like about it. She felt that libertarianism was essentially like a degrading of her own philosophy. It's not complete. It doesn't have it's not objectivism. So that's why she doesn't like it. and that's okay, right? And because libertarianism was never meant to be a complete philosophy of life. That's not what it is. It's a political philosophy that has many convergent points with other philosophies, and it's why that we agree that, or we would, my contention is that libertarianism is the most consistent expression of Christian political thought, and that we find that to be a good thing, but it doesn't. It is not. It's equating with objectivism is kind of where things went off, and the reason I kind of say that that's what we see through history is, that's certainly what I experienced as I began to learn more about libertarianism, going on 20 years ago now, is that there was this, sense in which if you were coming to a libertarian understanding, then, have you heard of Ayn Rand yet?
Right. Yeah, and I think that anyone who is coming to libertarianism already from a Christian background, you're going to be hit by that. At some point, you're, some relatives that are maybe already familiar with Rand and reject Rand, that you are going to come into that objection. Well, you can't do that. Or what do you mean? Are you going to start rejecting the faith now? Are you going to start, equating all these Christian values to altruism and then reject your faith?
Yeah. And that's certainly a challenge. We don't want we don't want that to be the case. We want to try to appreciate these good elements that she brought forward and whatnot, but to strongly act against those things that we clearly are not for.
Right, and we've already mentioned things that we do consider strong arguments from Rand and things that are valuable. What are some other good things that she's done for libertarianism?
Oh, well, certainly just the fact that she's introduced so many people to ideas of liberty that who wouldn't otherwise know. That's just a terrific thing. We can grant that to her, is that this is that what she did do was important for the libertarian movement. There's a lot of people who wouldn't be libertarians today were it not for what Ayn Rand has written. And, I hope that, in 100 years, we'll at least appreciate that, but have different avenues by which people will, come to a better understanding about libertarian philosophy. Hopefully LCI will be one of those, if we're still here in 100 years. But
well, hopefully in 100 years, we've convinced everybody to, believe in property rights.
That would be the ideal, right? Get there.
We've just barely scratched the surface here, but I think that we've given a general idea. I'm sure a lot of people already listening, they already know most of this, at least in the encounters that we're describing, encountering the objections to Ayn Rand. Or what would you recommend from or about Ayn Rand for someone to dig in a little deeper?
Yeah, she's of course written a lot of shorter essays that can help you to kind of get familiar with some of the basics of her thought, and she's written some shorter works, and then of course there's the larger ones. And I think that, look, if you're a reasonably smart person at all, you can, as a Christian, go in and read these books and walk away, having gained something. I believe that entirely. Like I don't see any of her works as being like, oh, well, you should avoid this work because it's going to make you lose your faith or something like that. No, that's not the way this works. Like we are able as Christians to take on all ideas and take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. So that's something, that we are empowered by the Holy Spirit to go and do such a thing. So go read Anthem, go read The Fountainhead, go read Atlas Shrugged, if that's what you want to do. It's a lot of work, I mean, to be honest, I haven't read
It's a
everything.
lot of pages.
Yeah, it's
there.
a lot of pages. And see, if that's what you want to do and go out and do, then you should not be afraid to do so. We do not need to be afraid of Ayn Rand, because she's just one woman amongst many people who don't believe, and so she's not to be feared. But she is to be understood, and I think that's where we can do that without necessarily having to engage with everything that she's ever written, and enjoy it for what it's worth. I mean, some of the things are great stories, and I enjoyed reading Anthem back in the day, and I've enjoyed reading The Fountainhead, and I've enjoyed selections of Atlas Shrugged even, and I think that's it's fine to do. The other things that you can do to kind of help yourself in this respect, there are people have endeavored to summarize her thought in various ways, even from a Christian perspective. We've got some essays on libertarianchristians.com that will help to bring some of that into focus, and that's a great thing. So I think that that's a great way of doing it for sure. We'll make sure and provide you some of those things for your show notes as well. There's a book even that I recommend that I encountered this a number of years ago by a guy named Mark Henderson called The Soul of Atlas. A subtitle is Ayn Rand, Christianity, and a Quest for Common Ground, which is a very interesting book about kind of looking at many things that Ayn Rand said from a Christian point of view, and teasing various things that are positive and negative from her thought. So I definitely recommend that as well. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to benefit yourself if that's what you really want to do. I would say that if what you're seeking is just a better understanding of libertarianism, and the influence that Ayn Rand has brought upon that, even picking up that book called "It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand" is probably a good idea as well.
Yeah, I completely agree that this isn't something that anyone needs to run away from or be shy of. I think that it's something that we should all at least have a pretty decent understanding of, and also understand that she's not the only person that is kind of wrapped up in this larger libertarian movement that differs with other libertarians.
Oh, for sure.
And so I guess getting back to what started this whole thing, your book, Called to Freedom. Can you tell us a little bit more about that book?
I'd love to. Well, first off, I'll say, it's not exactly my book per se. I was honored to be able to write the foreword to it. It's a book edited by Elise Daniel, and it has contributions in it from a small number of younger voices in the libertarian movement today who are also Christian. And the book, it's a wonderful little volume. These folks came to me a few years ago and said that they were embarking on this book project, and they were very interested in getting my input. And I helped them to get their publisher with Whiffenstock, and ultimately, have helped them, raise some money with their Kickstarter, and just was very much a promoter of the book from the very beginning. And I absolutely love it. It's a great small work for introducing Christians to libertarian ideas. It's not even, it's barely 150 pages long, but it's absolutely wonderful in its scope and breadth of what it accomplishes throughout the work itself. And they did a great job with it. We were able to help sponsor the audiobook version, so you can find on Audible and even on libertarianchristians.com means by which you can purchase the audiobook to listen to in your car or however you want to do that. And it's great. It's really, I can't recommend it enough as a great introduction to liberty for the Christian thinker.
Yeah, I completely agree. I really enjoyed the book. I liked how each chapter was contributed by a different author. You get a different feel for these different thought processes, and each chapter is a different topic, kind of that the Christian has to deal with, or anyone has to deal with libertarianism. But it does keep bringing us back to this idea about Christians.
Yeah, it's really great at kind of teasing out from the Scripture, from Christian history, from modern history, all the reasons why one would desire or look to to libertarian philosophy as having much better answers than what is currently out there today, being proffered by Christians on either the left or the right, as to how we should behave and interact politically in this world.
Absolutely. And so as we're wrapping up here, please tell the audience a little bit more about LCI. I'm sure that everyone listening is already very familiar, but if they're not, please, let us know a little bit more about LCI.
Sure.
And also I'll get those links from you for the show notes.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about what LCI is all about these days and kind of what we're up to. So for those who don't know, LCI's genesis was really in a website that I started back in late 2008. Just titled libertarianchristians.com. And my objective from the very beginning was to begin harmonizing or showing the congruence of Christian theology and libertarian ideas. And that evolved into what is now the nonprofit. We're a registered 501c3 nonprofit called the Libertarian Christian Institute. Still located at libertarianchristians.com and contains all of the historical material from that, from the prior iteration. And our mission is very simply to equip the church to promote a free society. And we're going to do that by creating the best content that we can that talks about the intersections of Christian theology and libertarian ideas. We believe, like I said earlier, that libertarianism is the most consistent expression of Christian political thought. And so we do the best we can to help promote those ideas and to teach people how to do that. Our surreptitious goal, elsewhere in many respects, is that not only are we trying to reach Christians with libertarian ideas, but we also want to teach libertarians who may not know much about Christianity why Christians can be their allies, and frankly tell them a little bit about the gospel while we're at it. And that's a great thing. I kid you not, we get at least a few emails every year from people who were libertarians and they write to me and say like, hey, I used to be a Christian, or I've never been a Christian, but after hearing a little bit about you guys, I started reading what you write. I realized that perhaps there were some things I didn't understand, and by the way, I'm going to church now, and I'm becoming more aware of what God has in store for me, and it blows me away every time. But I kid you not, it does happen. So it's a great thing. We're honored to be part of the libertarian movement and to be part of a ministry that has a reach into a demographic that perhaps maybe not being reached very well. We find it a great way of starting conversations with people. I mean, it seems kind of weird when you think about it that people don't like to talk about religion and politics, but somehow when we start it up together and we talk about nonviolence and the way in which we can interact as neighbors together through the free market and make differences in people's lives without the use of force, for some reason that just resonates with people. Who knew? So I think it's a great opportunity, for at least for me personally, to reach out to people and talk about ideas and make a difference in the world. And by golly, we invite anybody who's interested in trying to participate in the mission. We take guest posts. We interact with libertarians all over. We will involve you if you want to do the work. Come join us. We're ready and waiting for you.
That's excellent. And LCI and Anarcho-Christian definitely share, some of these same goals together. And so that's one reason why I wanted to reach out to you and have you on the show. And I just can't thank you enough for all the resources that LCI has been for me.
Well, we're honored to be part of that, man. And we support you guys all the way. We Lord knows that, put two libertarians in the room together and you're going to get like 5 different views, and similarly for Christians. But, it's a wonderful thing to engage with ideas, to be reasonable with one another, to learn from each other, and to always recognize that we're part of the same side, you and I, right? No matter what. Whenever we disagree, it's like, well, hey, so what? We're still Christians together. We're still trying to make a difference in the world for liberty and for Christ. Let's keep going.
Dr. Horn, I appreciate you coming on today and giving us your time and your knowledge on this subject. And I hope that we can do it again sometime.
Well, like I said, Stephen, it's been an honor. I really appreciate it. Let's keep working together, and we're gonna do good things.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. One last thing I would like to bring up before closing this out. We mentioned her opinions of Christianity and how it was directly related to her philosophy of objectivism. But I wanted to read a quote that really shows what we're referring to. This is from an interview that Ayn Rand did. She says, "Christ, in terms of the Christian philosophy, is the human ideal. He personifies that which men should strive to emulate. Yet, according to the Christian mythology, he died on the cross not for his own sins, but for the sins of the non-ideal people. In other words, a man of perfect virtue was sacrificed for men who are vicious and who are expected or supposed to accept that sacrifice. If I were a Christian, nothing could make me more indignant than that. The notion of sacrificing the ideal to the non-ideal, or virtue to vice. And it is in the name of that symbol that men are asked to sacrifice themselves for their inferiors. That is precisely how the symbolism is used." So, as you can see, Ayn Rand was not one to mince words or speak vaguely. I remember one time seeing something expressing her frustration with people asking her to clarify her points in her fiction works after their publications. And where most of us might like the opportunity to speak about our philosophy, I also see her frustration because she was very clear. But anyways, getting back to the statement, I know there are probably some varying opinions on the atonement and the state of man among you, but I think she accurately describes what the Bible tells us of Jesus and man. The problem is that it violates her value system. It's the greatest violation of that philosophy. We aren't talking about making a trade where you come up a few bucks short and you altruistically take that loss and the expense. We are talking about sacrificing your life for someone that absolutely does not deserve that sacrifice. And by any and every measure, we should have been on that cross. And Jesus, completely innocent, took our punishment. She's right. That's what Jesus did. But her self-professed indignance is a very good illustration of something we were told in 1 Corinthians 1. The last part of that chapter, verses 18 through 30, says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God, through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. I think that passage accurately describes her conclusion to the crucifixion, and it is something we can hang on to when confronted with this logic. So I hope you enjoyed that review of Ayn Rand, some of the things she said, and how that relates to Christian anarchists and libertarians. Have you had similar experiences with Christians and non-Christians bringing her up as a critique against the philosophy? I'll have links to the books that we mentioned in the show notes if you'd like to check them out. But I will also add that in some of her work there is content that is generally considered inappropriate for Christians. If you're not aware, you should be able to Google it or look into a summary before deciding to dive into the work or hand it to your kids if you're thinking about doing something like that. I think there are some very valuable things that we can learn from her and her philosophy, as well as having a defense when it's brought up. If you hear that if you're a libertarian, then you must be a Randian. Or if you're confronted by a Randian or an objectivist that says, if you're a libertarian, then you must be an objectivist. And if you are, then you can't be a Christian. You'll also have the knowledge to defend yourself and your faith there as well. All in all, I believe this is a good study because it strengthens our faith as well as our political or anti-political philosophy. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
I do not, and I've said repeatedly, I don't want to interfere with anyone or force anything on them. You have to make those distinctions voluntarily and yourself.